February 19, 1945, at 9 in the morning, a 23-year-old Marine crouched low behind a shallow dip in the black volcanic sand of a tiny Pacific island, his fingers wrapped around a weapon his own sergeant had once called a stupid idea. His name was Corporal Tony Stein. 6 combat missions behind him, not a single conventional kill on the official books. And in his hands he held something that did not officially exist. A machine gun he had built himself out of the wreckage of a crashed aircraft. Within the next 8 hours, that strange homemade weapon would tear apart everything the enemy thought they knew about how a single man could fight. The island was a fortress carved out of rock and ash. Across 8 square miles, the defenders had dug 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, packed in 17,000 soldiers, and built overlapping fields of fire that turned the open beach into a perfect killing ground. Stein was among the very first men of his company to push beyond the waterline and establish a position inland, and almost immediately the advance stopped dead. All around him, Marines were pinned flat into the sand by concentrated machine gun and mortar fire pouring out of camouflaged pillboxes they simply could not see. The enemy had hidden their guns inside the volcanic rock itself. By mid-morning, the division had already lost dozens of men. Bodies lay scattered across the terraced beach, twisted in the gray ash, and the survivors could do nothing but press their faces into the ground and pray. The problem was the weapons. The standard-issue Marine machine gun was a reliable thing, but it weighed 31 pounds empty and chewed through 400 rounds a minute. Good enough sitting still on defense. Useless for an assault that had to keep moving. The gun crews would set up, fire a few bursts, then spend long minutes breaking the weapon down and dragging it forward, and by the time they were ready again, the moment had already passed and more men were dead. Tony Stein had seen this coming months earlier. Back in late 1944, training in Hawaii, he had watched the machine gun teams fall hopelessly behind the rifle platoons during exercises. He understood the problem in a way most infantrymen never could, because Tony Stein was not really a soldier by trade. He was a toolmaker. He had been born in Dayton, Ohio, the son of Austrian Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe to build a new life in America. As a teenager, he had worked a lathe, then trained as a tool and die maker. He understood machines down to their bones. He knew exactly what a piece of steel could do, and exactly where it would fail. And when he joined the elite Paramarines in 1942, that mechanical mind came with him. On an earlier island campaign, he had killed 5 enemy snipers in a single day, but it was his gift for taking equipment apart and making it better that caught the eye of a sergeant named Mel Grevich. Grevich had been tinkering with something unusual. He had pulled an aircraft machine gun out of the wreck of a crashed dive bomber, a gun designed to be fired from the wing of a plane. It weighed only 21 pounds, a full 10 pounds lighter than the standard infantry gun. And it could spit out 1,200 to 1,500 rounds a minute, roughly 3 times faster than anything the Marines carried on the ground. The problem was that it was built for an aircraft. It had grips made for a pilot's hands, no proper stock, no sights, and no way for a single man to carry it and fire it accurately while moving forward. So Grevich brought it to Stein, and Stein saw exactly what it could become. The 2 men went to work at night in a maintenance shed, away from the eyes of anyone who might tell them to stop. Stein cut down a wooden rifle buttstock and hollowed it out so it would accept the aircraft gun's mechanism. He fabricated a trigger out of scraps of sheet metal with his own hands. Grevich welded a bipod onto the front. They bolted on rifle sights so a man could actually aim it. What they ended up with was crude and ugly and barely 25 pounds, fed by a box of 100 linked rounds that it could empty in about 5 seconds of continuous fire. They called it the Stinger. Stein built 6 of them in total, 1 for each rifle platoon in the company, 1 for the demolition section, 1 for Grevich, and 1 for himself. The reaction from the other Marines was split right down the middle. Some thought it was brilliant, others thought it was a death trap waiting to happen. One sergeant looked at it and swore it would jam on the very first burst. Another said the thin barrel would melt after 2 magazines. An officer from another battalion scoffed that only a fool would carry a plane's gun into an infantry fight. But then Stein took it to the range and emptied a full 100-round box into a target 200 yards away in under 6 seconds, and one by one, the skeptics went quiet. The company approved it. The battalion approved it. The Stinger was going to war. Now, on the beach, Stein tightened his grip on the weapon. The barrel was already warm. All around him men were dying because nobody could find the hidden guns. The usual answer was to call in the tanks or the big naval guns, but the tanks were sinking helplessly in the soft ash, and the warships could not hit what no one could see. So Stein made a decision that should have gotten him killed in the first 5 seconds. He stood straight up. In the middle of an open beach, with enemy machine guns covering every inch of it from a dozen overlapping angles, Corporal Tony Stein deliberately exposed his entire body to draw their fire. He needed them to shoot at him. He needed to see the muzzle flashes. He needed the enemy to reveal exactly where they were hiding. Bullets cracked past his head. Mortar rounds burst in the ash beside him. And then he saw it. A pillbox, 75 yards to the northwest, so well hidden under volcanic rock and sand that he had stared right past it a moment before. The barrel of a heavy machine gun jutted out just a few inches from the slit. Stein dropped the Stinger to his shoulder, lined up the rough sights, and squeezed the homemade trigger. The weapon came alive with a sound like tearing canvas, 1,200 rounds a minute hammering into the rock and sandbags. The enemy gun simply stopped. Through the swirling dust he could see movement inside, then nothing at all. He swung the barrel onto a second pillbox 40 yards to the left and held the trigger down. Another 5 seconds of fire. The concrete soaked up some of it, but the sheer volume was too much, and that gun fell silent too. And all around Stein, something shifted. The Marines who had been frozen in the sand saw the enemy guns go quiet, and they began to move. Riflemen rose out of their shallow holes. Sergeants started shouting again. The assault that had died on the beach was suddenly, impossibly, alive once more, and it was all because one toolmaker from Ohio had refused to stay down. Stein charged the first pillbox. The Stinger was light enough that he could actually run with it, something no man could do with the heavy standard gun, and he covered the distance in seconds. Inside, 3 enemy soldiers lay dead, that blistering rate of fire having cut straight through everything in the cramped space. He moved on to the second position and found the same scene, 2 more men down, the bunker silenced. And then the Stinger went light in his hands. The ammunition box was empty, 100 rounds gone in less than 10 seconds of actual trigger time. He had known this would happen. He had felt it coming in training, the simple, brutal arithmetic of a weapon that fired 3 times faster than anything else. The Stinger was devastating. It was also impossibly hungry, and the only ammunition was back at the supply point, 200 yards away at the water's edge, where landing craft were still unloading under mortar fire. To get there, he would have to cross open ground completely exposed. So he started running. The volcanic sand fought him with every step. This was not ordinary beach sand. It was loose, terraced ash that gave way underfoot, and the Marines had a name for moving through it. They called it running on ball bearings. Stein's boots sank 3 inches deep with every stride. Halfway down, he came across a wounded Marine, a young private with shrapnel through his leg, conscious but unable to walk. Stein didn't hesitate. He hauled the man over his shoulder and kept running. The Marine weighed 160 pounds. The Stinger weighed 25. His combat pack added 30 more. He was carrying well over 200 pounds through that shifting ash, while mortars walked up and down the beach behind him. He reached the supply point, handed the wounded man to a corpsman, and grabbed 4 boxes of ammunition, 100 linked rounds each. 2 went into his pack, 1 in each hand, and he turned and ran straight back toward his platoon. Enemy snipers had begun picking off Marines moving between the beach and the forward lines. Bullets kicked up black ash around his feet. A mortar round burst 30 yards to his right. He did not stop. When he reached the company, his sergeant pointed him at a 3rd pillbox, bigger than the others, reinforced concrete with a light machine gun covering the path toward the airfield. 2 assaults had already failed against it. 4 Marines lay dead in front of it. Stein loaded a fresh box, checked the feed, and simply stood up and walked toward it alone. The gun opened up at once, rounds snapping past his head, but he kept walking. At 50 yards he opened fire, and the Stinger's rate was so high the enemy gunner could not adjust fast enough. Stein's rounds found the firing slit, and the gun went quiet. He sprinted the last 20 yards and dropped a grenade through the opening, killing the 3-man crew inside. Then he turned to reload, and the box was empty again. Less than an hour into the battle, he had already burned through 300 rounds. The Stinger was proving everything Stein had promised, but the cost was clear. This weapon could destroy enemy positions faster than anything in the Marine Corps, and it would demand an endless river of ammunition to do it. So he ran again. On this trip he found 2 more wounded men, one with a sucking chest wound, the other missing part of his hand. He couldn't carry both, so he took the chest wound first, delivered him to a corpsman, grabbed more ammunition, and then made an entirely separate trip back for the second man. By mid-morning Stein had crossed that murderous stretch of beach 4 times. 4 times he had carried a wounded Marine to safety. 4 times he had come back loaded with ammunition. His platoon had pushed 200 yards inland and knocked out 7 enemy positions, and Stein himself had killed at least 15 men. But the Stinger was beginning to suffer. The barrel was discolored from heat. The homemade trigger was starting to stick, and his boots were falling apart, the soles nearly gone, every step driving sharp pain through his arches. So Stein made another decision that looked completely insane. He unlaced his boots and kicked them off, standing barefoot in the volcanic ash. But there was cold logic behind it. The ruined boots were dragging on him, and the rigid soles couldn't grip the loose ground. Barefoot, painful as it was, he could actually feel the terrain and find his footing. He pulled off his helmet, too. Between the two he had shed close to 5 pounds, and 5 pounds was the difference between life and death, for a man whose whole job had become getting across that beach faster than the snipers could track him. His next run took barely 2.5 minutes. Barefoot, he could finally get traction, sinking into the ash but reading the ground beneath him. The coarse ash tore at his feet like broken glass, but it was faster, and faster was all that mattered. He scooped up another unconscious Marine on the way down, carried him to the corpsman, loaded up on ammunition, and ran back. By late morning he had made 6 full trips, 6 wounded men carried to safety, 600 rounds delivered, 5 more enemy positions destroyed. His platoon had clawed 300 yards off the beach and was closing in on the first airfield. But the enemy resistance was only getting worse. They had built a living defensive web of pillboxes, spider holes, and underground bunkers, all linked by tunnels. Destroy one position, and moments later soldiers would pop up firing from another a few yards away. The Stinger was the only weapon in the entire company that could pour out enough fire to keep several of these positions pinned down at the same time, and the men had learned to read its rhythm. When Stein's gun roared, they moved. When it fell silent to reload, they dropped and waited. No orders were needed anymore. The whole advance had begun to breathe in time with one homemade machine gun. Then, on one of his return trips, a single round snapped past his head, close enough to feel. Stein dropped flat into the ash, the Stinger landing beside him. For the first time all day, he was pinned. A sniper had moved on to the ridge to the east, hidden in a spider hole 200 yards away. The enemy snipers were patient, disciplined men, trained to wait hours for one valuable target, and a barefoot Marine sprinting across open ground was about as valuable as a target got. Stein lay dead still and controlled his breathing. The next round cracked overhead, fired at where he had been, not where he was. The shooter hadn't pinned him exactly yet, and he had seconds before that changed. So he rolled left, snatched up the Stinger, and came up running, not away from the sniper, but straight at him. The logic was cold and simple. Run across the man's line of sight and he was a hard target, and if he could close the distance, 100 rounds a second would beat a bolt-action rifle every time. 3 shots chased him and all 3 missed. At 150 yards, he caught the movement in the spider hole, dropped to a knee, and let the Stinger off its leash. The rock around the position came apart, and when the box ran dry there was no return fire at all. By early afternoon the Stinger was a wreck. The barrel was bent, The bipod had snapped off, the wooden stock was charred black, and the homemade trigger was firing random bursts of its own accord. But it still fired. And then, during an assault on yet another pillbox, the thing Stein had always feared finally happened. An enemy machine gun scored a direct hit on the Stinger itself, tearing it clean out of his hands and hurling it 6 feet back into the ash. Stein dove behind a ridge of rock, suddenly unarmed, his weapon lying in open ground between him and an active enemy gun. They had seen it fall. They knew he was disarmed. They were waiting for him to come for it. He could see the barrel smoking, the feed mechanism damaged. Even if he reached it, the gun might not fire. But he had carried that weapon through trip after trip across the beach, and it had kept his entire platoon alive. So he sprinted into the open. The enemy gun opened up instantly, rounds snapping past him as he ran a desperate zigzag. He reached the Stinger, rolled behind cover, and found the belt feed jammed where a round had bent the guide rails. With his bare fingers, he cleared the jam and slammed in a fresh box. It fed. Then he stood up and emptied the entire box into the pillbox that had nearly killed him. 100 rounds in 7 seconds, and the position simply ceased to exist. The Stinger was hit a second time not long after, a rifle round to the receiver that dropped it into a shell crater 10 feet away. Once more Stein ran into the open for it, and this time a grenade burst 5 yards behind him, driving shrapnel into his leg and back. The wounds were not enough to stop him. He grabbed the gun, dove into the crater, and worked the action by hand. It was stiff, but it functioned, and even at half its original speed the Stinger was still faster than anything else on that battlefield. He suppressed the trench while riflemen swept in with grenades, and another 6 enemy soldiers died. By mid-afternoon, Stein had fired well over 2,000 rounds, made 8 trips to the beach, and carried a wounded man back on every return. His feet were bloody, his uniform was soaked with sweat and the blood of the men he had carried. The Stinger's barrel was bent, its stock held together by friction and hope, its trigger firing at random. But the company had reached its objective at the base of the mountain that loomed over the southern tip of the island, the high ground from which enemy spotters could see every American on the beach. That mountain would have to be taken next. That night, infiltrators crept against the lines, and the battered Stinger still had one gift left: volume of fire, and when an enemy soldier appeared 30 yards out, Stein cut him down. The next morning the assault on the mountain began. Stein carried the Stinger up the brutal slopes, an armorer having patched it overnight, and used it to suppress a bunker complex, while demolition men moved in with charges. And then his luck ran out. A grenade landed 3 feet away. He saw it, tried to move, and it went off before he could clear it, driving shrapnel into his arm, leg, and torso. He was bleeding heavily, but he refused evacuation and kept fighting for 2 more hours, suppressing every gun that opened up on the advancing Marines. Only when he was nearly bled white did the Corps men finally force him down to a hospital ship offshore. His war should have ended there. Doctors pulled shrapnel out of his arm, leg, and torso, and told him he was headed for the rear. But days later, word reached the ship that his division had pushed north into the meat grinder at the island's center, that his company had been shredded, its sergeants dead, men he had trained beside dying on a nameless hill. Against direct medical orders, Tony Stein climbed into a landing craft and went back. He talked his way onto the beach, requisitioned new boots for his still-bandaged feet, grabbed a rifle, and walked 6 miles north across the island to rejoin what was left of his company. It had been reduced from 240 men to 63. He was put straight back on the line. For 2 more days he fought in close, grinding combat with nothing but a rifle and grenades. Then, on March 1st, 1945, his company sent out a small patrol to locate a complex of enemy pillboxes, and Stein, named assistant patrol leader, moved to the front to get a better look at the ground ahead. His bandaged feet ached with every step. His wounds had not healed, but he moved forward because that was simply what he did. At 7:52 in the morning, a single shot rang out from a concealed position a couple hundred yards off. It struck Tony Stein in the head, and he dropped instantly. The corpsman reached him in seconds, but there was nothing to be done. He was 23 years old. He was buried on that island, and a year to the day after his stand on the beach, his widow accepted his Medal of Honor. The citation described the personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, the way he stood upright to draw fire and expose the enemy guns, the way he charged the pillboxes one by one and killed 20 of the enemy in that single furious assault, the 8 trips under fire, the wounded he saved. It never once used the name the Marines had given the gun. That name lived only in their memories. So here is what that black beach should never be allowed to forget. A toolmaker from Dayton, the son of immigrants, built a machine gun out of the bones of a crashed airplane in a maintenance shed, and then he carried it into the worst place on earth, and used it to do the impossible. He stood up when every instinct screamed to stay down. He ran barefoot through ash like broken glass, 8 times, under fire, and carried a wounded brother back on every trip. He destroyed more enemy positions than anyone could count, killed 20 men in a single morning with a gun the experts swore would jam, and saved 9 lives before lunch. When they wounded him, he kept fighting. When they shipped him out, he came back. Tony Stein lived 2 years and 5 months as a Marine, and he spent the last of them proving that courage and a good idea, welded together by a man who refused to quit, could change the shape of a battle. The enemy never could quite believe what one man with a homemade gun had done to them. Neither, in the end, could we.